holy city. Her eyes have seen the rise and fall of empires, conquest for power and the divine presence. Historic events that occurred in Jerusalem are the foundation stones of the faith of billions of people around the world and have made this city one of the most important places on earth. Jerusalem's story is the story of kings and prophets told by ancient artifacts buried deep within the borders of her walls.
But this is not where my story begins. The story of Jerusalem begins on the small section of land where the city of Israel's great King David once stood, and where the holy city Jerusalem, that is so loved today by billions of people around the world, was first founded.
We are standing now on a hill that is called the City of David. This is a narrow promontory with very steep slopes. In fact, it's not a very large site. The entire hill is about 4 hectares in area. Yet this is a very important site because here really the history of Jerusalem started. Around 5,000 years ago, people lived here for the first time in the early Bronze Age. And we have on this site evidence and remains from various periods of occupation. 2nd millennium BC, that means hundreds of years before King David. In like 18th and 17th century BC, huge fortifications were built here. Huge water system was cut into the mountain, into the rock of this hill.
The residents of the ancient city of Jerusalem didn't have refrigerators and indoor running water like we do today. But just like the Jebusite before them, when they needed water, they went to a nearby spring or creek to get water and filled pottery jars or animal skins and brought the water back to their homes. Here we are inside the ancient water tunnel deep underground. Above us is the site of the ancient city of Jerusalem. It was first the city of the Jebusites and later became the capital city of the united monarchy of Judah and Israel under King David. Today above us are houses where Arab residents of East Jerusalem live. Under the ancient city of Jerusalem, where we are right now, there is a complex water system like ancient plumbing that was literally carved out of the rock. The first phase of this water system was built during the time period that we call the Middle Bronze Age, or about 3,800 years ago. At that time, it was the Canaanite civilization of ancient Canaan.
Now the Bible tells us that the people who lived here before David were Jebusites. This term Jebusites is unknown to us from any documents outside the Bible, and we don't know who were those Jebusites and to whom the Bible refers when it says Jebusites. Perhaps it refers to the local Canaanites who lived here during this Bronze Age, those hundreds of years before the arrival of the Israelites. The Bible also tells us that King David was enthroned at Hebron, south of Jerusalem, and he was a king of Israel and Judah there for about 7 years. And after 7 years, he and his group of soldiers, of warriors, headed by Joab, conquered Jerusalem, Jebusite Jerusalem, and turned it into a place called now the City of David. The Bible said that David conquered the Citadel of Zion, Metzudat Zion in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the Citadel of Zion, and turned it into the City of David. Now, what is the historicity behind this story? What can we know? What can archaeology tell us about this? The fact is that we don't have almost any evidence, any written records outside the Bible, except one monument, a stela, a monument that was found at Tel Dan in northern Israel, who mentions Judah, the kingdom of Judah. This is the only time where David is mentioned in a document outside the Bible. And it's dated to the 9th century, about 150 years after the presumed date of David, who, according to the biblical chronology, ruled in the first half of the 10th century BC.
Artists have portrayed King David in many ways. In European cathedrals, King David was depicted as a medieval king. In the Venetian Republic, he was portrayed as an Eastern king crowned with a turban. At the end of the 19th century, we find a biographical portrait of the young King David playing his harp by Dutch Jewish painter Joseph Israels. But at the city of David in Jerusalem, many believe we have found King David's palace in a building that was supported by a large step-stone structure.
This building that was supported by the stone structure was recently excavated, and we have remains of foundations, though not very well preserved, of foundations of a very large building, which was interpreted by Eilat Mazar, its excavator, as the Palace of David. We don't actually know if this was the Palace of David, but we can say with quite a great deal of confidence that this was a large building, a public building, dated to more or less this time. The pottery that was found below the foundations of this building is dated to the 12th and 11th centuries BC. That means before the time of David. The pottery that was found among the stones of this building and right on top of the stepped stone structure is dated to the 10th and 9th centuries BC, which is the time of David, Solomon, and their successors. We also know that buildings that can be seen from here, just above this stepped stone structure, are dated to a later time during the time of the monarchy, the 9th or 8th and 7th centuries BC. They were finally destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed Jerusalem at the year 586 BCE. So our stepped stone structure, this large building, and the building above it that is related to it, have to be dated to a time which corresponds more or less to the time of David. We cannot say for sure, of course, such a thing, but there is a great chance, I believe, that this building was standing here during the time of David, and perhaps was, in my view, it could be, for example, the Citadel of Zion, the same citadel that David took hold of.
The site of Khirbet Qeiyafa became world famous overnight due to the discovery of what many scholars believe is the oldest Hebrew inscription ever found, and especially important because it is dated to the time of King David, which supports the view that parts of the Bible were already written in Hebrew at the time of King David in the 10th century BCE.
One of the main questions that modern research trying to verify is the kingdom of David. Some minimalist theories said David didn't exist at all, or if he existed, he was a Bedouin living in a tent, and that there was no kingdom at all. And other people who following the biblical tradition said he was a great king, he ruled from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And I think that the important things of Khirbet Qeiyafa that is giving us a more realistic picture about the kingdom of David. It's not everything or nothing, it's something in between. And I think that if you're taking the biblical tradition and our data here, you can see that the Bible said that David started at Hebron, later he conquered Jerusalem. Hebron and Jerusalem is about 1 day walk. Khirbet Qeiyafa is in the middle. From here to Hebron is 1 day walk, and from here to Jerusalem is 1 day walk. So I think that this is the beginning of the kingdom of David.
Archaeologists connect the site of Khirbet Qeiyafa to the time of King David when he ruled in Jerusalem because its location is in Judah in the Elah Valley, where the Bible says King David fought the Philistine giant Goliath on the border between Judah and Philistia, and objective carbon dating which dated Khirbet Qeiyafa to the time of King David.
And then we discovered 2 gates. And 2 gates in Hebrew means sha'araim. 1 gate is sha'ar, but when you have 2, it's sha'araim. And 2 gates is something that you don't find in any other city. If you go to Lachish, to Megiddo, to Gezer, Chatzor, other biblical cities, they always have only 1 gate. And this city, while it's rather small, has 2 gates. And 2 gates mean sha'araim. So it cannot be an accident that you have in the Elah Valley a city called Sha'araim and a city who has 2 gates. These things are connected to each other.
Archaeologists date a site by the pottery that we dig up, and at Khirbet Qeiyafa we found pottery that had been buried for 3,000 years, the same kind of pottery that King David used when he lived and ruled in Jerusalem. While the people that lived here were most likely Judeans, the pottery suggests they came in contact with the Philistines because we found Ashdod-ware pottery named after the Philistine city Ashdod. The builders used massive stones, and in the west gate we found a huge threshold stone weighing 6 to 8 tons. How the ancient builders moved these stones is still a mystery.
And all of this testifies that this was a major fortified city or perhaps garrison during the 10th century.
We're excavating an ancient drain here. This drain out the gate, water, sewage, food particles, etc. So we're excavating this dirt out of here, then we're going to sift it all and see if we find bones or olive pits or anything else. I just uncovered a few pottery fragments right here.
Well, we've excavated a lot of Philistine sites, and the architecture here is very, very different. These huge stone structures, the gates, as well as the casemate wall, are typical of Judean cities. We don't have them at Philistine sites. We have mostly mud brick architecture and not this kind of building technique. The casemate walls, these double walls that have rooms in them, are found at several other sites in the region, like Tel Bet Mirsam, Beersheba, Gezer during the 10th century, and they all testify to Judean architecture of this time period.
In the 8th century BC, Jerusalem and Judah, the kingdom of Judah, stood in front of a huge danger. About 20 years earlier, around the year 722, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, was conquered by the huge military power, the military empire that is called the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians arrived from northern Iraq of today, the area of Mosul of today, and they conquered every city on their way. Their goal was to conquer the entire ancient Near East as well as Egypt. King Hezekiah, the king of Jerusalem, decided to initiate a kind of revolt against this military power. He built a huge wall around Jerusalem, a large, massive city wall that was found in the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem. It was excavated in 1969-70. It was a kind of a 7 meters wide stone wall that surrounded entire Jerusalem. He also cut the tunnel, the so-called Hezekiah tunnel, which was intended to bring the water of the spring, the main spring of Jerusalem, into the now surrounded, now fortified city. By doing this, he prepared his city against this Assyrian siege.
This is the second tunnel below Jerusalem, and it is one of Jerusalem's most famous archaeological discoveries. Too big to put in a museum, but something that you can actually walk through, kind of like traveling back in time into the days of Hiskiah in the 8th century before Common Era, or about 2,700 years ago. The famous Siloam inscription that was found inside this very tunnel, recorded in ancient Hebrew carved into the rock on the side of this tunnel. How the builders carved the tunnel from the two opposite ends and met in the middle. דבר הנקבע, וזה היה דבר הנקבע. בעוד מניפים החוצבים את הגרזן, איש אל רעו, ובעוד 3 אמות להינקב, נשמע כל איש קורא אל רעו, כי היית זידה בצור מימין ומשמאל. וביום הנקבע היכו החוצבים איש לקראת רעו, גרזן על גרזן, והלכו המים מן המוצא אל הבריכה ב200,000 אמה, ומעט אמה היה גובה הצור על ראש החוצבים.
Some archaeologists were skeptical about whether this was really the tunnel King Hezekiah built, just as it is written in the Bible.
Rising to the challenge, scientists took small fragments of plants and wood that were in the plaster along the walls of Chizkiah's tunnel and used carbon-14 dating methods to find out the absolute date for the tunnel.
Carbon-14 dating doesn't give you an exact date like September 5, 701 BCE. But what the team of scientists did find is that the range of dates matched the time of King Hezekiah in 701 BCE, giving dates between the years 800 to 510 BCE during the Iron Age II period, which was the time of the biblical kings.
The style of writing on the inscription also helps archaeologists to date the channel to the time of King Hizkiah. As certain as we can be, this channel is the real thing.
He also produced a huge amount of jars, called by us Lamelech jars, because they are sealed with a kind of a very interesting seal impression mentioning belonging to the king, followed by one of 4 names of cities. These jars, we think, were used to bring supply to the front, to the army, to places which were supposed to be under the Assyrian threat. And in fact, in the year 701 BC, the Assyrians arrived with a huge power, a huge military force. They destroyed entire Judah. They destroyed Lachish, the second fortress after Jerusalem, after a long siege. And then they put siege on Jerusalem.
רוני בת ציון, הריעו ישראל, שמחי ועלזי בכל לב, בת ירושלים. הסיר אדוני משפטייך, פינה אויבך. מלך ישראל, אדוני בקרבך, לא תראי רע עוד. צפניה פרק ג'.
The Bible was written so long ago that finding ancient copies of the Bible stored in caves in Israel near the Dead Sea was one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are world famous, but not everyone knows what they are. They were found some 60 years ago in a difficult area in the middle of the desert near the Dead Sea, and that's why they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were actually found in caves, hidden from the public eye, and they tell us the story of things that happened and were written as much as 2,000 years ago. Complete surprise. We never dreamt that we would find such very, very important scrolls from so long ago. They are scrolls written in the Hebrew language, that's the same language as the Hebrew Bible, in Aramaic, a language related to Hebrew, and also in the Hebrew Bible we have books written in Aramaic. But in addition, a few scrolls were written in the Greek language, a language that was spoken also 2,000 years ago. The provenance of the scrolls is unclear. They were found in Qumran, yes, but were they written in Qumran? This is a major question for scholars. We scholars think that there was a place in Qumran where at least some of the scrolls were written, were penned down. Scribes, that's the term we use, were probably sitting in a certain room in Qumran and penning down some of these scrolls, but just how many we don't know. In my view, having studied certain systems of writing and of spelling of the scrolls and of scribal habits, I think that 1/3 of the scrolls that are large enough for analysis were probably written at Qumran, but 2/3 were brought from the outside. Now, were from outside, we don't know, but I believe that quite a number came from Jerusalem.
The Dead Sea Scrolls were written during the time that archaeologists and historians call the Second Temple period, which was the time of Herod the great rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and Jesus of Nazareth and his disciples.
The Temple Mount, which dominates the view of Jerusalem, was built in the general form we see it today by King Herod during the Second Temple period. Excavating the site of Qumran and the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Judean desert near Qumran was like finding a missing piece of the temple in ancient Jerusalem. the temple was the center of political and religious life in ancient Israel. 3 times a year, ancient Israelites ascended to Jerusalem. Jews from all over the world convened here in one place to bring their gifts to the temple and present them to the ancient Levites as part of the celebration of the Jewish festivals in ancient Israel. In our time, each year millions of people from all over the world travel to Jerusalem to visit the site of the ancient temple.
There is a mystical quality when you first look upon the Temple Mount. Today, the Temple Mount is known by Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif, where the Dome of the Rock stands, along with the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
This same mount is the place where Abraham is believed to have been tested by God in the Akedah, or the near sacrifice of Isaac.
The various steps leading up to the inner platform on the temple may preserve the Temple Mount as it was during the time of King Herod, and perhaps even some elements of King Solomon's Temple Mount, although archaeologists are forbidden from excavating here. Walking on the very Temple Mount itself, you can sometimes sense the holiness of this place, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe the very presence of God dwelt in Solomon's temple.
In the year 692 of the Common Era, the Islamic Caliph Abd al-Malik completed building the Dome of the Rock on the very place that the Caliph before him, Umar the Great, believed he had built a shrine on the location of King Solomon's great temple. Jerusalem is rich with Islamic archaeology in the form of architecture.
But something Muslim residents of Jerusalem may not consider so ancient as it is where they worship, live, and work in their daily lives.
The Kotel, or the Western Wall, is today the holiest site of Judaism and has likely been revered by Jews as a holy place of prayer for over 1,000 years, especially since the construction of the Dome of the Rock prevented Jews from praying at the very site where the temple once stood. While all those who choose to pray here realize that it is only a foundation wall of the Temple Mount itself upon which the temple stood, nevertheless, it preserves a direct continuity with temple worship, daily prayers just as in temple times, the reading of the Torah, and where young Jews are led through the bar mitzvah ceremony.
And even with a willing faith, Solomon's words still echo down through the centuries. Will God really live on earth? Why even the highest heaven cannot contain you? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is also the place of the cross, the universal symbol today of Christianity, and it is believed to be built over Golgotha, the hill upon which Jesus was crucified on a Roman cross, and where Christians believe that 1,000 years after King David made Jerusalem his capital, Jesus of Nazareth rose from the dead to fulfill the ancient Jewish hope of a Mashiach king. It is also here, in what once was a rock-cut tomb, that many Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead and first appeared to a young Jewish woman named Miriam HaMagdalit, or in English, Mary Magdalene.
She was from a small fishing town called Magdalit, near the Sea of Galilee, and had become one of Jesus' followers, and was one among many women who had come from the Galilee to care for Jesus while he traveled.
ומרים עמדה בוכייה מחוץ לקבר. בשעה שבכתה, התכופפה אל תוך הקבר, וראתה 2 מלאכים עוטי לבן, יושבים במקום שקודם לכן נחה גופת ישוע, אחד למרשותיו ואחד למרגלותיו. אמרו לה, אישה, למה את בוכה? השיבה להם, לקחו את אדוני ואינני יודעת איפה שמו אותו. אחרי שאמרה זאת פנתה לאחור וראתה את ישוע עומד. אך לא ידעה כי הוא ישוע. שאל אותה ישוע, אישה, למה את בוכה? את מי את מחפשת? הואיל וחשבה שהוא שומר הגן, אמרה לו, אדון, אם אתה העברת אותו, אמור נא לי איפה שמת אותו, ואני אקח אותו. אמר לה ישוע, מרים. אז פנתה ואמרה לו, רבי. יוחנן חף.
Every visitor to Jerusalem experiences the history and archaeology of the city at their every step, but the identity of those who live in Jerusalem is rooted both in the ancient past as well as the present.
It is a modern urban city where ancient traditions and contemporary life mix together into one eclectic unity. You can see visible symbols of these social barriers in traditional clothing, but there is also something invisible that lives in the minds and hearts of those who dwell here. Jerusalem is a city of many peoples and faith that today, in their day-to-day lives, live together in unity.
For many of Jerusalem's Jewish residents, each day is lived with the consciousness of a darker time in human history during World War II and the Holocaust. It is just as much a part of Jerusalem today, and for some, it is a past that is always just below the surface.
I'm sitting here right now in Jerusalem, but I was born in Amsterdam quite a while ago, at the beginning of the Second World War in the year 1941, when Holland was occupied by the Germans. That was not the best choice I made in my life, to be born exactly at that time. And at that time, as most people know, the Germans didn't give the Dutch a free way of life, and particularly not the Jewish people. They were persecuted. And soon after I was born, my parents had to go in hiding, and they were clever enough to hide me separately because they were more in danger, and I, as a little baby, could not easily be detected. So they gave me to a Christian family when I was 1 year or a little more old, and I stayed with that family as part of their family for those years from 1942 until the end of the war. I don't have many memories of that period. Unfortunately, my parents did not survive the war. They perished in a concentration camp, or basically in 2 different concentration camps. And after the war, my Christian foster parents were with me as part of their family. My aunt and uncle survived, and they claimed me, and there was a little lawsuit, as there was for all my friends who were with Christian families at that time. And after the lawsuit, my uncle and aunt took me into their family, and from that time onwards they were my parents, and I grew with their family in a happy way with my brother and 2 sisters. That was obviously not a happy part of my life, but still I have very good memories of a very pleasant youth. The whole story of losing your parents, and actually most of my relatives, is not a happy one in my history. And obviously, it's not something I thought about occasionally, but it's there always, all the time. And it's part of my life. You learn to live with it. It is part of the life of many of my friends who came afterwards with us to the land of Israel. And we accept this as a fact. What this does to your religious feelings is hard to summarize. For some people, it strengthened their belief because, so to speak, God had chosen them to survive the war. In my case, I don't feel this like a kind of election, but I see the difficulties at a theological level with regard to the fact that my parents were killed and I survived. I can't say that I, even at this stage, that I summarized my views, what this whole experience does to my religious feelings as a Jew. It is a very difficult situation with which you live, and it shines through from time to time in your life, when you marry, when you have children, and when you have grandchildren, because each time you say to yourself, well, I survived, and my children are there, and my grandchildren are there.
The clouds gather more closely about us, and the circle which separates us from the approaching danger closes more and more tightly. Now we are so surrounded by danger and darkness that we bump against each other as we search desperately for a means of escape. We all look down below where people are fighting each other. We look above where it is quiet and beautiful, and meanwhile we're cut off by the great dark mass which will not let us go upwards, but which stands before us as an impenetrable wall. It tries to crush us, but it cannot do so yet. From the Diary of Anne Frank.
Billions of people consider Jerusalem their spiritual home, and it is impossible to visit Jerusalem and not to see and feel the cacophony of life that exists here, the strange mix of the moment-to-moment peaceful coexistence between Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and the ever-present tension due to the absence of peace and the irreconcilable differences of those who live here. And perhaps this is what Jerusalem teaches us, that we can only do as much with life as we've been given for each day and not worry about the days ahead. To love and to be loved, to love our neighbors as ourselves, and to try and find our place in the world.
Even though conflict remains, we continue to seek for the ideal that Jerusalem represents, and search for the story told by ancient artifacts buried deep inside Jerusalem and the sites that surround her, that open a gateway to an ancient world. Of all human pursuits, understanding the past shapes our present just as much as it does our knowledge of the past. And in hope, we search for the path that will lead us to a future peaceful coexistence.